piece of bread smaller than your hand, which weighed barely 50 grams. That's all a German soldier had to survive on during the brutal winter of 1942 in the Kessel, German for cauldron, an encircled pocket of Stalingrad. Trapped in a frozen city under Hitler's orders, survival wasn't about bullets, but hunger. This is the story of how the 6th Army was starved to death. More than 250,000 men, hardened by years of war, advanced on Stalingrad in July 1942. Their mission? Crush resistance, seize Stalingrad, and move on to the oil fields of the Caucasus. Initially, they were confident. They believed they had everything they needed to win. The Wehrmacht ration system was designed to sustain them even in the harshest conditions. 3,000 to 3,200 calories a day for each soldier. 700 grams of bread, 137 grams of meat, 320 grams of potatoes, 250 grams of vegetables and fruits, 40 grams of sugar, and 9 grams of coffee substitute. It was a balanced plan, seemingly perfect for the grueling days ahead. Typically, the day began with a quick cold breakfast of bread, butter, and some meat. Midday, a hot stew from the mobile field kitchen, and a lighter bite in the evening. Together, roughly 3,000 calories before the encirclement. It seemed reasonable, didn't it? A full day's meal to keep them moving through the chaos. Even on the battlefield, victory seemed inevitable. The Germans pressed forward, street by street, determined to crush Soviet resistance. They controlled close to 90% of the city, but war, as we all know, rarely plays by the rules. What seemed like a carefully crafted plan quickly fell apart under the weight of reality. In the shadows, the Red Army was preparing a counterblow, and by 19 of November to 23 of November 1942, the trap was sprung, Operation Uranus, which trapped the 6th Army in a Kessel, German for cauldron, an encircled pocket. They were surrounded in a frozen city at temperatures around -20 to -30 degrees Celsius and with no way out. The efficient logistical system that had supported their campaign collapsed. The only way to keep the soldiers inside the Kessel alive was from the air. To fight, they needed 750 tons of supplies every single day. To simply survive, at least 500. But the airlift never came close. The distance to airfields, weather, aircraft shortages, Soviet fighter planes, air defense, and the loss of airstrips made meeting even the minimum impossible. Most days, it managed barely over 100 tons. That meant rations cut short, ammunition running out, and fuel tanks running dry. Within days after the encirclement, General Friedrich Paulus gave the order. Rations were to be cut in half. Bread dropped to barely 350 grams, meat to just 60. Fat, sugar, and vegetables were slashed as well. That left each soldier with roughly 1,400 to 1,600 calories a day. And to grasp how dire that was, men fighting in the brutal cold needed more than double that, at least 3,000 to 4,000 calories. From that moment, survival wasn't measured in victories or territory anymore. It was measured in hunger. This was the point where an entire army began to starve. By December 1942, the situation grew even more desperate. Rations were cut again to just 200 grams of bread and 60 grams of meat, often horse meat. That meant barely 800 to 1,000 calories a day, only a third of what a soldier needed to function in the frozen hell of Stalingrad. In short, the combat readiness of the 6th Army was extremely limited under these conditions, and the soldiers suffered both physically and mentally from starvation. On December 21st, the first death from hunger was officially recorded. 3 days later, on Christmas Eve, the Army High Command received an even darker report. 64 men had already died, not from bullets, not from bombs, but from hunger itself. German soldiers who thought they were fully prepared and in control soon started starving to death instead of dying from bullets. By January 1943, the 6th Army in Stalingrad had sunk to rock bottom. Daily rations were now nothing more than scraps. 100 grams of bread, sometimes only 50. That's just 120 to 240 calories. One soldier summed it up in a single haunting line: 1 loaf of bread for 5 men. Every so often, a sliver of horse meat or a bowl of watery soup added a few more calories, but it hardly mattered. In total, men were surviving, if you could call it that, on 300 to 500 calories a day, less than 15% of what the human body needs just to stay alive, let alone fight. The carefully planned rations were gone. The bread, meat, and potatoes disappeared in the chaos, and the soldiers were left with barely enough to stave off hunger. The thought of a full meal became a distant memory, while the cold gnawed at them from within and without. At this point, the soldiers were handed the iron ration, an emergency ration meant for the worst of times and usually opened only on an officer's order. Inside were hardtack, canned meat, and vegetable preserves, weighing just a few hundred grams. It provided calories enough to survive for a day, but only if consumed completely. Imagine rationing that meager portion while your body screams for food. These men couldn't even eat it freely. They had to wait for permission to take rations that gave them a chance at survival in a war where the enemy wasn't just the Soviet army, it was hunger itself. As the weeks wore on, the situation only grew more dire. With no reinforcements, no hope, and the cold draining their strength, they were battling their own bodies. Then came the fatal blow. January 17th and 23rd, the last functional airfields, Potomnik and Gumrek, inside the pocket fell, severing the last link between them and salvation. From that point, the airdrops were nothing more than a few scattered, uncoordinated deliveries, often lost or delayed. As the winter dragged on, the soldiers were pushed to the brink. With their field ration supply out of commission, they turned to whatever they could find. Horse meat from horses that once pulled artillery and carried supplies was now boiled into thin soup, offering barely enough to keep them from collapsing. Dogs, cats, rats, even crows, nothing was off limits in their desperate hunt for food. But when there was nothing left, they scavenged bone broth, water soup, or raw frozen potatoes. 50 to 100 calories was all they had. The soldiers, now skeletal and broken, faced a brutal truth. Starvation had already defeated them. On January 10, 1943, in a final act of defiance, Hitler promoted General Paulus to Field Marshal. The message was clear. No German officer with that rank had ever surrendered. Paulus was expected to fight to the death, but by then, his army was broken, starving, freezing, and exhausted beyond recognition. They could barely hold a rifle, let alone continue the fight. 2 days later, Paulus defied Hitler's unspoken command. He surrendered. And with him, the remnants of the 6th Army, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, laid down their arms as little more than shadows of the soldiers they had once been. Of the 91,000 German soldiers taken prisoner in Stalingrad, only 5,000 to 6,000 would ever make it home. The rest were consumed by starvation, disease, and the merciless grind of war. What had once been a proud and formidable fighting force ended as a warning etched into history. Stalingrad proved that an army can be destroyed not only with bullets and bombs, but by something far more silent: hunger. In the end, it wasn't Soviet firepower alone that broke the 6th Army. It was the absence of something so basic, yet so vital: the food that sustains life. But this story is only one chapter in the countless untold horrors and acts of survival that continue to shape our world today. If you found this story chilling, don't miss what's coming next. Hit subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and join us as we uncover more of history's darkest moments.